Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Hoporenkv podcast. My name is Crystal Cedino, and I am the Training Development Manager for the Native Learning Center. I'm thrilled that all of you are tuning in for another episode this week. With that being said, I have my two hosts. We have two separate hosts and then a special guest today. So I'm going to go ahead and let Vince and Cora introduce themselves. Say hi, Vince.
Oh, hi, Crystal. Thank you. This is Vince speaking. I'm the Compliance and Resource Development Director for the Native Learning Center. Been there for about 10 years. Have worked in the past directly and indirectly with our speaker today, John Clancy, who I know you'll hear his wonderful voice in a few minutes, but I'm just thrilled to be here. So thank you, Crystal.
Yeah, thank you. And Cora, go ahead and introduce yourself as well.
Hello, everybody. I'm Coralise Anthony, and I'm the Training and Development Specialist here at the NLC.
Awesome. Thank you. Cora's my right hand. She helps me coordinate all these things. So I know we're both thrilled, and Vince as well, to have our special guest, John Clancy, who is an attorney for Godfrey and Kahn. Is that correct, John?
Yes, I am. Yes.
Awesome. So go ahead and just introduce yourself so that our listeners know who you are.
Sure. Thank you. Again, I'm John Clancy. I head up Godfrey and Kahn's Indian Nations practice, and it's in clean energy practice, basically, as well as I'm a leader on the environmental team. So I work with tribes a lot on a variety of matters, including protection of the reservation from environmental impacts, but then also a lot on funding projects, funding sustainable housing projects, funding energy projects, and other projects that help tribes meet their goals.
Awesome. So to say the least, you are very familiar with Indian country.
Yes, I am. I've been working with tribes for about the last 20 years or so.
Awesome. We love that. Thank you so much. Okay, well, today's topic is, at least the title that we have here, is Once in a Lifetime Opportunity to Fund Tribal Housing. What can you tell us about that, John?
Yeah, I think we're at a really important time right now. It's in large part, frankly, because of COVID. Because of COVID, there's been a lot more funding going to tribes, the Indian country, and then just to governments in general than there has been in the past. This has involved both particular COVID relief packages, like the American Rescue Plan, which is the most recent plan to come out, or package to come out, as well as what's come out of the budget bills and the last 2020 budget as well. And really what's happened is that there's been a lot more funding coming in country, and I think secondly, and almost as importantly, there's been a significant change to some of the tax credits available for housing as well. And using those together really allows tribes at this time to both develop new housing and to rehab their existing housing in a way that they couldn't do in the past.
No, I think that's amazing and wonderful as well. Vince does most of our grant writing, if not all of the training sessions that we have.
Right.
Yeah, Vince, any thoughts on this, on your end at least?
Well, I think this is a real exciting thing for, as John, alluded to, this is a real exciting development for Indian country. So I think, I'm just hoping that there are a lot of tribes that recognize this, and I'm grateful for John to take the opportunity to share this information with Indian country. There's lots of opportunities out there. Very, very exciting.
Absolutely. I muted myself. All right. So, I mean, we kind of touched on, why we think, or, well, why is this a once in a lifetime opportunity? Let's go ahead and go over that.
Yeah, I think what it is, I think again, it's largely because of COVID. I think it's because also I think both parties are starting to realize the importance of making housing affordable and making housing available really throughout the country, but then also especially for Indian country. And I think that has resulted in very significant funding that could be used by tribes for housing and for other things, a lot of it. But there's a lot of housing, there's a lot of money out there also that's specifically available for housing. And then again, as I mentioned before, they've kind of they made the 4% tax credit program, which is, I'll talk about a little later on. There's both the 4% and 9% program, but they made it so it's really usable for low-income housing development, whereas in the past it was really not nearly as valuable. And then especially now, because of the fact there's so much money out there available to tribes in the form of grants, that the two can be used together. You know, in the past, a 4%, I'll talk about this in more detail later on, the 4% program really didn't push you over the amount needed to make your housing development really work. Now, because there's a lot of money available through grants and the related programs that can be used in combination with that, that's why I think we're really in a unique time right now, that we have from both sides, both the tax credit side and the purely funding side from the federal government, we have really significant available funds available to, again, address both new housing and, just as importantly, to rehab existing housing that needs to be rehabbed.
You know, that question, John, I see, you know, from some of your notes here, that some of these monies are available for the ICDBG, you know, the Indian Community Development Block Grant. And I see that there's also other opportunities under the Indian Housing Block Grant, the HUD Section 184, and several others, where, especially with the ICDBG coming up, I think there's if I'm not mistaken, there's a deadline right around the corner for the ICDBG. Yeah. How do tribes go about getting this, applying for these funds, for the tax credits and for the funding that's available? What's their first step in applying or getting more information on this at a minimum?
Yeah, I think I guess one thing is that, checking out HUD's website on the ICDBG is very important, and knowing exactly how that grant works. There's a lot of tribes that go for this every year and have become very successful because the grant is essentially the same every year, the requirements for it. Yeah. And it's not a simple grant, but it's not nearly as complex as some of the I'll talk a little later on about, Department of Energy grants, things like that are much more complex. So I think if you can get your arms around how it's, what it is and how it's scored, because they really lay out for you in that grant, especially, what you need to get certain points. So you should be able to kind of self-score yourself and put in an application that can really work. One thing that's important to know on a lot of these grants, including the ICDBG, is that they have, leveraging or cost share requirements, and things like the 4% tax credit and other funds. Also importantly, if you're doing either new housing or rehab, there might be state funds available for that too, that you can maybe be able to look at your project and say, hey, I can meet it with the ICDBG, plus, let's say, some state funds on energy efficient rehab or energy efficient projects in general, or just state funds towards housing. So I think the key thing is to, like you said, Vince, right now, look at that grant application closely, learn how it's scored, and then also think through how you strategically meet your cost share, or in that case, leveraging, they call it. I think there's a variety of sources to meet that. You could even say we're going to meet it, for instance, first, if we can't get other funds through our NAHASDA funding, but we're going to go pursue these state and tax credit funding to meet it other ways along the way, if you're not, all set up for that yet.
Very good. Very good.
Wonderful.
Yeah, wonderful opportunities.
Yeah. Well, you kind of alluded to this a little earlier, but what provisions of the American Rescue Plan are relevant to tribal housing?
I think there's, several. I guess, the biggest one, which is generally applicable to tribes, so it's not just housing, it can be used for a variety of purposes, but the biggest dollar amount is the $20 billion in funding made available to tribes. $1 billion of it is allocated equally to tribes, and the $19 billion is allocated based primarily on population this time around. It was a little different with the CARES Act, but that's the way it's focused now. But those funds can be used for affordable housing as well as other purposes. So the real question for a tribe to think about, I think, in the Tribal Housing Department or Authority and working with the tribe is, how important is housing compared to other needs on the reservation? But if it's an important need, this provides a lot of funding that can be available for that, or in part for that, and then the ability to combine it with other funds is very valuable, because you can use that as cost share for other projects, leveraging for the ICBG grant, for example, if it's for housing. A variety of ways you can strategically use that to grow it, because what you really want to do, whatever the amount of money allocated to your tribe is, you want to make it used for things that are important to the tribe, and then kind of grow that money so you can leverage with other sources. And again, you could leverage it with funding available from potentially your utility or your utility program on energy efficiency measures. You can leverage it in a lot of ways, including the 4% tax credit. On top of that, there's $750 million in direct housing assistance available, which includes $455 million in Indian housing block grants and the NAHASDA funding, which is very valuable to tribes and can be used for really a wide variety of purposes, as long as it's for affordable housing. And then the $280 million in Indian community development block grant money that's available as well. That's a lot of money when you think about it, in the sense that the amount that came out from the last budget bill was $70 million for ICDBG or Indian community development block grants. So there's really a large amount of money available, either targeted solely at housing or available generally to tribes, that should be thought about for this type of activity.
Excellent. And that's probably, Crystal, it's probably, John, probably a good time. You had mentioned renewable energy projects, so maybe this is a good transition here to move into that discussion on energy efficiency and renewable energy projects to lower tribal housing costs. Can you highlight some areas in that for us, John, in that arena?
Yeah, sure. There's I guess one thing just to point out, as you mentioned, Vince, how you handle energy can really make or break the affordability of the tribal housing on the reservation. And the reason for that is that you can, tribal housing authority and tribes can utilize the kind of money we just talked about before to develop and rehab housing in a way that doesn't need to raise rents much, basically, to keep rents low. And in fact, under those programs, typically you're required to keep the rents low. But the issue beyond that is that the utilities themselves, especially electricity and gas, let's say, or propane, so for heating and electrifying the homes, that those costs are not handled by grants typically. There may be money that's available to particularly assist certain low-income folks, but in general, they're stuck with a lot of these payments, or the housing authority is stuck with all these payments. Yeah. And so if you want to make the housing, truly affordable, you want to address that as well, because that's your key operating costs that they face as renters. So then the question becomes, how do we address that? And the good news here is that there's a lot of programs that are available to bring in projects that either make the homes more efficient or provide energy for the homes, potentially for free, if it's like, for instance, with solar. Once the projects are put in place, the costs of maintaining that project are very low, so you can have almost free energy for the housing units. And one program that's probably the most important to think about here is the Department of Energy Tribal Energy Program, because that's a program that's specifically focused on helping tribes put in place projects that either increase the efficiency of buildings or provide energy for buildings, and oftentimes renewable energy. And what that's oftentimes used for is for solar, for homes or other buildings like that. And the good news there too is that during the latest budget bill, the one that came out in 2020, they changed it so that the cost share can be reduced on that grant. It's historically been that it's a 50% cost share, meaning that half the project costs have to come from the tribe or other sources, and not from the grant, and not from other federal funds, typically, at least. There's some exceptions to that. But now there's the ability to request for a cost share reduction. And then also, just like with housing, where you have the 4% and 9% housing tax credits, which can leverage funds that are available to tribes. In the energy area, especially for solar and certain other renewable energy projects, there's up to 26% tax credits available, which can be used to cover the remaining costs after a DOE grant, especially if you can reduce cost share. In fact, I'm working right now with the Spokane Indian Housing Authority. They have a project that's going to provide solar to 160 homes. It's paid for 3/4 by the DOE grant and the remainder by the tax credit. So it's fully funded that way. And I think that it's a great opportunity now in light of how they've adjusted the DOE grant program to do projects like that.
John, in the past, I've heard you talking about net metering as a way for tribal entities to use energy, renewable energy. Can you talk about that a little bit? Does that fit into this equation?
Yes, it does. Yeah. So,
about?
if you put, especially with solar, for example, if you have solar and you don't include battery storage in it, you just have a straight solar project, for example, for homes, which is, and solar is probably becoming the most typical way of meeting the energy needs of homes on site. There's other ways too, but that, when you have solar energy, it only produces energy when the sun's out, and it produces more in the middle of the day than it does in the afternoon or the morning. It also produces more typically, if you're in northern climates, during the summer than the winter. And so the issue becomes, how does this energy production match up with the energy usage at a home? And in homes, oftentimes everybody's gone during the middle of the day when the sun's shining most brightly, and then they're back at night or early in the morning or whatever when it's not. And so the big issue is, how do we get full value for that energy production? And fortunately, a lot of utilities have what's called net metering or something similar to that, where they'll provide oftentimes the full retail value of the energy, regardless of when it's produced compared to when you use it. So it really makes the solar fully valuable, basically. All the energy you produce knocks down your energy bill by the retail rate you pay. So that's a very important thing. And it's a great point. If you don't have that, you need to think kind of strategically, how do we meet those concerns? One way is through battery storage, which is becoming much more economic now. And then a lot of tribes are in more remote areas, so they're actually facing a lot of grid reliability issues where big storms, especially now we can think about it with the Ida recently occurring, big storms occurring, knocking out the lines. That's where battery storage is probably most valuable, besides, if you don't have net metering, to help keep the homes going, keep the buildings going.
Is Tesla still leading the way when it comes to battery storage and technology?
I'd say they probably are, but I'd say there's a lot more players now, so it's becoming, the reason why this stuff is all making sense now is in part, for tribes, in part because of the programs they're talking about, but it's also in large part because the price of solar has come way down from what it was, 5 or 10 years ago. The same thing is happening now, and actually happening more than with solar, with battery storage. The prices keeps on coming down. In fact, I was reading an article where over the last about 10 years, it's gone down by 15% every year, just like a step down. And so what's happening is that it's becoming more and more doable, more and more feasible. That's another important point, is that like if you're putting solar on the homes, you probably want to think through, even if we're not putting battery storage in now, how do we set it up so we could add storage later on? Especially if you're in an area that has resiliency problems, you have where the grid goes down. So other tribes I work with, if a major storm comes through, they may be down for days or even a week or more. And those are the ones that really want to make sure they're set up to keep everything going, keep the homes going for the members, keep the buildings going for everybody in general during these times.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept. I can see where, when you take in consideration just the fact of global warming, you would think that would, be one of the leading indicators of an increase in solar use. And then the other thing that you had pointed out, in our discussions in the past, is sometimes it's not so much the solar, but it's the infrastructure that the tribes struggle with in setting up the solar. What do they call them? Solar fields and solar, because there's a cost involved in having the infrastructure to be able to use some of these alternative energy, solar in particular, right? Is that the case?
Yeah, it could definitely occur, and there could be situations where you need to, where if you're going to hook up essentially a larger solar system, you'll need to help pay for the grid improvements for the grid to accept that big energy source. If it's just going on individual homes, it's probably not quite as much of an issue. On the other hand, if you put in a big system, it's probably going to be cheaper per unit per kilowatt, which is the unit of measurement for solar and for other energy projects generally. So a lot of that needs to be just kind of weighed out. What makes the most sense to do? And for instance, do you have a grant that could cover that cost, or is that somehow for some reason outside the grant? Typically, it can be covered. So, and then does the tax credit cover that as well? So you really want to kind of think through strategically what's the best approach for our homes and our members. One thing also on it is that if you put it on the rooftops, it's generally it's a little bit more removed. It's probably safer from any kind of damage. So all those factors have to kind of come into play so you get the best result. Just like any other project, you want to make sure you think through all the angles and get the best project for the tribe and its members.
And where do the tribes typically go for this kind of funding? Is it Department of Energy?
Yeah, I think that typically, as I mentioned, the Department of Energy grant is a source that a lot of folks utilize. Another one actually I might point out, although it has a lot of demand for the money by tribe, just because it's multi-purpose, is the Indian Community Development Block Grant. We've worked with tribes that have used that for solar, especially for solar for homes. It's considered an eligible rehab project under that grant. And again, if you combine it with the tax credits, you can typically cover the full cost of the project, including the leveraging. So that becomes very attractive to a lot of tribes. But again, on that one, you can have a lot of, because it's can be used for a multitude of reasons, or a lot of different, for a lot of different types of projects that are related to affordable housing. There's oftentimes a lot of demand for it. That's where then the DOE grant, the Department of Energy grant, kind of comes in if you have the ICBG is already essentially taken.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of funding, because I know we kind of alluded to this earlier as well, but do we want to go ahead and mention other key funding available for this, now that we're talking about, these projects and so on and so forth?
Sure. Well, I guess another key funding to talk through really is, in addition to the kind of grants you can get from the federal government, are probably two things. One is your state may likely have funding for these projects. Your state could either be through the utility or through, like I'm in Wisconsin, so we have what's called Focus on Energy, which is really a consortium organization for all the utilities, or most of the utilities at least, and they provide incentives. For instance, they provide an incentive for residential solar as well as commercial scale solar. So that could be combined with a DOE grant, an ICDBG grant, or other, federal funding. And then on top of that, there is, I mentioned before, a federal investment tax credit for solar. So if the project is begun this year, it would have a 26% tax credit on it, on the project. The good news with solar is that it covers the entire project typically, or at least almost all the project, if not all the project. And then that can be used to pay for the cost share on a lot of these grants. It also can be used as a mechanism to just bring in more funding in general, because what you do, and this is an important point, because this relates to both housing tax credits and investment tax credits. Tribes and tribal housing authorities can't directly receive that money because of the tax credit, and tribes don't pay taxes and housing authorities don't either. But if they partner with an investor, then the investor gets the tax credits. They actually get two things. They get the tax credits and they get depreciation of the project. So because of that, what I found is that oftentimes they're willing to give the full value of the tax credit to the tribe, because they just keep the depreciation then. And then it becomes like another grant on the project then. But it can also become even more valuable than a grant, because it might be able to cover more than the 26%, because the investors oftentimes will bring whatever the remaining amount of the project amount is to the project. I'm working on a really big microgrid and solar project right now, which is for one of the tribes in California. And then that one, the project cost, the remaining project cost after the grants is substantially more than the grants cover, but the investor is covering all of it. And then there's just going to be a power purchase agreement back to the tribe, where until it buys out the system, it'll be able to buy energy at a fraction of its normal utility cost, and then use that to pay back the investor. So the good news is there's a lot of tools in this area to get things fully funded. especially if you're a little bit creative with the grants, federal grants, plus the state money, plus the tax credits.
Wow.
So, yeah, incredible. And do these programs have leveraging requirements?
Yeah, they typically do. The federal grants do. So the DOE grants I mentioned before historically has had a 50% cost share requirement, but now they allow you to basically request that it be reduced. So it can be reduced significantly. I think it may be possible to bring it down as low as 10%, but clearly at least by 25%. The state programs generally do too, because they just don't provide, well, it's not always the case. So some of the state programs, especially for low-income housing, I think it's very important to check this out. Some states for low-income housing will pay for all the energy efficiency improvements at least, or at least a very high percentage of that cost. So it's very important to check that out too and be aware of what's available. But typically the programs will pay for, a certain amount towards various improvements, whether they're energy efficiency or renewable energy. And then there's a de facto basically, cost share then, because you have to cover the rest of the costs. But the good thing for that is that typically, like for instance, the DOE grant requires you that the cost share typically be non-federal. Well, the state money is non-federal, and then fortunately DOE takes the position that the tax credit money is also non-federal. So all that can be used together very, very well, very effectively.
Love that. So much opportunity here. And with that being said, because we've thrown around 4%, 4%, so on and so forth. So is the 4% housing tax credit program an important source for leveraging? It seems like it is.
I think it is. I think it's become more valuable, and that's a good point, because in the past, they'd called it the 4% tax credit, but it really wasn't a 4% tax credit. It was something less than that. It was in the threes, which, it might sound like what's the difference between 3% and 4%, and why is 4% even, why do we care about 4%? Well, the reason is that the tax credit's over a 10-year period. So the investor gets back a 4% tax credit every year for 10 years. So together, that's 40%. So you can see that then covers a good chunk of the project costs. It comes in over time, so it's not as valuable as getting the full 40% up front. So the investor may discount what it provides in the benefit to the tribe, but it's still very significant. And then on top of that, if you're in certain areas, the tribe may actually be able to get closer to strike that. If you're in certain areas of the country, instead of it being a 4% tax credit, it really goes up to a little bit over a 5% tax credit. And so that really becomes valuable, because that's over 10 years, 50% of the project costs. And that's where I think it's important to be thinking about this program now, especially because, again, we talked about it earlier, there's a lot more money going into any country with the $20 billion coming in from ARPA. And then on top of that, the money coming in from ARPA for housing. And then on top of that, the various grants that either have been available all the time or are being increased now under the federal budget to go into housing. So you have a really good chunk of money you can use from the grants, the federal grants. Then on top of that, you can leverage with the 4% tax credits. And then I think another bucket you should be thinking about always is what's available through the state. And a lot of that is, the energy improvements are oftentimes under a state or utility program that will pay for a large percentage of that too, especially if it's a rehab. Because what the states tend to do, they tend to focus their money on trying to rehab older homes, because they're the ones that use the most energy. So it's the most effective for them to put the money into improvements for those. So if you're working on a rehab project for your tribe, you should be thinking about all those sources of funding, because they can all leverage each other.
Awesome, thank you. And I mean, just from hearing you discuss this, it kind of sounds like it has, but has the 4% tax credit program been improved lately?
Yes, it has. Yeah. So under the budget bill from 2020, they Congress decided, and the president signed it, to make the 4% tax credit program really a 4% tax credit program, to make it so that you really get the 4%. And then on top of that, the ability in certain areas to get a higher tax credit yet. And the reason why 4% is important, because there is also a 9% program, which then, provides funding for 90% of the project costs over 10 years. That's a competitive program. And a lot of tribes apply for it and may not get it. It still makes sense to apply for that program and pursue projects under it. but it also makes sense to say, well, we got all this funding coming in from the federal government now. We can put on top of that state funding to have a good pot of money to use, and we can leverage it with a 4% tax credit, which is much less competitive.
Awesome. And why not use the 9% credits instead of 4% credits, since the 9% credits should help fund a larger portion of the projects?
Yeah, and again, it's all just because of the competitive nature of that program. There's been a lot of tribes. Some tribes have gotten it and have gotten those credits through competitive applications somewhat repeatedly. A lot of tribes have not. And one thing about the 9% tax credits and applying for them, that's applied for through the state. So some states have programs that are more where the scoring is more beneficial to tribes. The other states don't as much. I think things have been improving in that area generally to understand that we need to kind of make it so tribes can get the credits too, given the significant need for housing, especially low-income housing on tribal reservations. But still, it's very competitive. You may likely not get those credits even if you apply for them, even if you have a generally good application. So it probably makes sense to be pursuing both avenues. If you get the 9% tax credits, great. Or you might say, we have so much housing we need to get done. We're going to do some of the 9% program. We're going to do some using a lot of this federal funding that's available now through grants and use the 4% on top of that.
Yeah.
Amazing. So much opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, one thing that I found that was interesting, and I learned something, you had mentioned that the matching or leveraging was somewhere around 50% in some cases, but tribes and tribal entities are able to, correct me if I'm wrong, able to appeal that.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, able to appeal it to a lower percentage. I think it would behoove them to try to reduce that matching requirement to something less than 50% is a considerable amount of matching requirement. And if you can get it down to, you had mentioned 10%, that would be, to me, that would seem phenomenal, you know?
Yes, no, I think that's exactly right. And so with the prior DOE grants that came out before this legislative change, they did actually, DOE did put out an opportunity to reduce cost share. And that's what some of my clients, we went for that, obviously. And for this Spokane project I mentioned, that's an example of that. They had a 50% cost share obligation. It's now down to 25%. And then we have these tax credits to fill in that hole.
Yeah.
They can fully fill it in. So that's the kind of example of what you'd want to do. I think and I think it's a little bit strategic, you know, how much of a cost share reduction would you ask for and what's your basis for it? But if you could match it up to what your other funds are, you could then fully pay for your project.
Yeah.
Amazing.
And correct me if I'm wrong, just one more question for me, then I'll stop. I just have lots of questions. Yeah, I would think under the current administration, under the Biden administration, that you know, I would think that the trend, correct me if I'm wrong, John, the trend towards renewable energy would be nothing but a growth potential under the current administration. Is that your understanding as well?
Yes, I think, and there's a couple of points there that are really important. I think one is that there's been a series of executive orders by President Biden, which focus on two things that are relevant for any country in this area. One is to kind of do everything possible to address climate change and thereby, you know, increase renewable energy and energy efficiency and stuff like that. And then two, for agencies to work with tribes to try to benefit tribes to the extent possible. When those two things come together, you have an opportunity for a lot of this kind of action to occur. And then I think, you know, secondly, on top of that, is really, and this is an open question still, what is going to be in that $3.5 trillion infrastructure bill that was, bill hasn't been passed yet, but the idea of going through reconciliation has already passed both houses. So they're working right now on what that will contain. That's the infrastructure bill that's supposed to focus on more social justice issues and climate change issues. So, and both of those relate to tribes, obviously.
Yeah.
But especially for what we're talking about now in the climate change area, there likely may be very significant grants available, kind of like what came out of ARPA for tribes generally, but now focused more on energy projects, on microgrid projects, on solar projects, on energy efficiency projects. All those kinds of things, tribes should really be following that, because that can then be used, that money can be potentially used combined with the tax credit funding we've been talking about to really supercharge both housing development, kind of clean, sustainable housing development, and then also just energy development on reservations to make tribes energy self-sufficient, to address their significant reliability to address the significant reliability issues that tribes face with energy, and then also to meet what I found has always been the case, strong tribal goals to go towards clean energy.
Wonderful. Yeah. Well, speaking of ARPA, I know we, discuss a lot of like low income and so on and so forth, low income housing. But I'd like to think that many tribes would like to fund middle income housing. So is there ability to use the 20 billion in ARPA funds for them?
I think that there's at least the potential to do that. There's Treasury regulations that have come out about this that support the use of the funding for affordable housing. They don't necessarily define what affordable housing is, but they also talk about, benefiting tribes and qualified census tracts in this area. And then when you look at under NAHASDA, what tribes can do to designate, critically important individuals to be present on the reservation, basically, and therefore to basically get affordable status, tribes could, I think you'd want to communicate with Treasury about this, but say it's critically important that we have housing for our members, including some of our members that may not get housing. If a member is doing really well, we don't need to help them out. But for this middle income category that are above the 80% of median area income, but still, not having enough funds to be able to afford a house on the reservation, and you would use the ARPA funds in part to help them out. So I think that's a very important thing to be thinking about. And a lot of our tribal clients, they're trying to address kind of two housing issues. One is housing for their lower income members, and then housing for their kind of middle income members that otherwise can't afford to come back to the reservation. So I think it's a very important issue for tribes to be in communication with Treasury about, and to present arguments why you can use it for the middle income, and to pursue that to the extent it makes sense for the tribe, because some tribes have more concerns about affordable housing, some have more concerns about middle income housing. A lot of them have concerns about both. And so trying to develop a plan that can meet both is very important.
Awesome. Thank you so much. You are such a wealth of knowledge. Thank you. Thank you. Vince, did you have anything else you wanted to add or inquire about or anything like that?
Well, based on my limited knowledge of everything that John's been talking about, he has sufficiently answered all of my questions that I can think of. Thank you, John.
Great. Thank you.
Cora, you're good?
No.
Awesome. All right. Well, let's go ahead and wrap up this episode. John, do you want to do a plug-in for yourself? These podcasts are a great way to kind of do that in case anyone has any questions or anything like that.
Sure. If listeners have any questions about what we talked about, I'd be more than happy to talk to them. My email address is the letter J and then Clancy, Clancy, @gklaw.com. And, I think that, given my work in this area, I think it's as I mentioned before, it's becoming a great opportunity for tribes to basically have sustainable housing and other development occur on the reservation. One more thing is that there is, HUD has technical assistance programs, which I think everybody's aware of. One thing they're probably not aware of is that you can seek assistance from someone like me to go out on the reservation, or perhaps now with COVID virtually go on the reservation, at least for the time being, to really develop a particular plan for your development on the reservation, including clean energy development, sustainable housing, that kind of thing. If you just, there's a 2-page request, very simple, that can be asked for. And if you ask for help with renewable energy and energy efficiency for housing, you'll probably get me, frankly. And that's an important way to, free of charge, have tribes kind of develop a plan that makes sense for them, and considering the utility situation on the reservation, what you pay for energy, what programs are available in your state from your utility, and then putting on top of that all the kind of stuff we talked about on the federal side to make a real plan, make it work. Hey, actually, can you ask me, if you don't mind asking a question just about the right of ways and how that can be used for leveraging too? That'd be great. That's that third thing I said, just because I think that's an important way for tribes to get money over time that can be used for leveraging for these kinds of projects too.
Okay. Sorry, repeat that one more time. The right of ways.
That's the third.
Yeah. Obtaining maximum value for rights of way.
Okay.
Maybe a couple questions there to wrap up the session, perhaps?
Yeah, I just want to make sure people are aware, because we've had some clients one client is getting millions of dollars a year from that for leveraging. So,
well, we're all ears. What is rights of way, and who needs it?
Yes.
well, I think there's been another important development that's occurred in any country under the Obama administration. They changed the rules for rights of way. And what is a right of way? A right of way is really an easement or other kind of pathway the tribe provides to governmental entities like states and counties that put roads to the reservation, like utilities, especially for transmission lines, electrical, gas lines, oil pipelines, all need rights of way. And the way it worked in the past was that BIA would issue a right of way, the tribe would sign off on it, the tribe would be paid a nominal sum, and then the pipeline or transmission line or other line would go through the reservation. Now, with the new rules, tribes can set the fee for these lines coming through. And especially if we have clients where the lines, the rights of way are expired and these lines are in trespass. That's occurring all throughout the country on Indian reservations. And our clients have been able to set the fee for renewal on these lines. One tribe is going to receive over $1 million a year from these lines. And another tribe we're working with that just has lines that just only serve the reservation, but they're still going to get about close to $100,000 a year on those lines coming through, and they'll be able to regulate them now too. Since the way it works now is the tribe can require whatever it thinks is appropriate for the consent for the line, and the tribe can set as part of that the consent fee. So if the tribe can work to set up appropriate ordinances on consent, you can also set property tax requirements. Our tribes have done that as well. We've worked with, and then potentially have trespass ordinances for these lines that are in trespass, so you can have a leverage to go after them on this. I think as long as the fees are reasonable in light of what the lines are and what they serve, whether they serve the reservation or if they're big pipelines that go through the reservation, or transmission lines, electrical transmission lines that go through, there's the potential for a tribe, especially that has important lines going through it, to get very significant fees. And another key issue is that it helps fill in that gap we've been talking about on these various grants. Typically, a lot of grants from the federal government, especially if they're not just to operate the tribe, they're to try to develop infrastructure, develop housing, things like that. They have significant cost shares we've been talking about. This is another way to get a significant pipeline of funds that can then be available to go after this federal money with your cost share, as well as, frankly, be used for anything else that's valuable to the tribe. It could just be that the tribe needs more money for its operations in general. But regardless, if a tribe, especially in more rural, remote tribes, it might have a lot of these lines going through the reservation and don't have the ability to have, valuable gaming rights or other, kind of business rights, can use this to create another significant source of income to the reservation, to the tribe, and thereby better serve its members.
What a great possibility for revenue for the tribe. And did you say that the generation of the fee and the consent and the trespassing possibilities, those are all new developments that tribes can take advantage of?
Yeah, I think it's generally speaking a new development. I mean, the ability for tribes to tax and to have trespass ordinances may have already been all out there. That's under federal law. That's a position the tribe could take at least. but the rules make that much more clear, the new rules under the Obama administration. But what's really new is the ability to set the fee itself. And the important thing to think about is that, it's important then to have a good sense of what's on the reservation. What are the lines on the reservation, and are they in trespass now, or do they have an existing right of way to develop the appropriate strategy? But another thing to think about is that the ability to tax now, and that what's clarified by the rules on that position, can be just as valuable, because the property tax could be set at the same level as the right-of-way fee, and perhaps can even be higher, because it can cover lands owned by members as opposed to just lands owned by the tribe itself. So it's a really important area, I think, because it creates another income stream to tribes. It can be long-term and can be steady. And that's, as everybody knows in this podcast, that's really important as you try to build out your infrastructure and just develop your tribal sovereignty and governance.
Interesting. Yeah, you had mentioned that one of the tribes has something near $1 million when it comes to right-of-way fees.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, how does a tribe come up with something that's realistic? $1 million seems like something that's astronomical to me as a fee. What is reasonable? How do they go through that process of determining what is a reasonable rate to charge for a right-of-way fee structure?
That's a great question. And I think it really depends on an analysis of what kind of lines are on the reservation and who do they serve. So that tribe has multiple transmission level lines going through gas and electric through the reservation that don't really serve the reservation, but they're very important to the transmission owner because it's a key link in their system. So for those, the fees can be set, at a level that still be reasonable, but are significantly higher than you would if the lines were only going to serve the reservation. For instance, if your tribe is kind of end of the line for electricity and gas and stuff like that, and the lines only serve the reservation, the fee would probably be less, but it still could be relatively substantial. And you still might apply a property tax to that fee. And another thing that's important to know is, or to think about is, what kind of entity are you working with here? If it's a public utility, a public utility, investor-owned utility, or public utility company that's regulated by the state, at least like here in Wisconsin, they can pass through those costs to the rate structure in general, not to the the reservation, but to the whole area they serve in the state. And so they can it can just be kind of a cost of doing business for them. So I think as long as the fees are relatively reasonable, they could still generate a lot of revenue, especially, even if you're, even if all the lines only serve the reservation, but the reservation is relatively large and it has a large number of members and accounts on it, the fee could be still very, very significant. So, but again, we were talking about $1 million plus a year. That's probably where the lines serve off reservation as well and are significant type lines. But there's a lot of tribes that have that, because there are a lot of tribes that have a lot of land base, like the ones in the Dakotas, the Midwest in general. Oftentimes have a larger, or in the West too, have a large land base. There's these lines running through the reservation. The tribes have historically gotten no benefit from them. Now you really can.
What an opportunity. Wow. Fascinating. Thank you for explaining that in detail.
Oh, great.
Didn't even realize it was a possibility, or let me put it this way, didn't realize the magnitude of it until you started describing the potential for creating right-of-way revenue for the tribe based on the amount of transactions that are occurring and pipelines and whatnot flowing through tribal property. What an opportunity for non-traditional revenue generation for tribes. Thank you for explaining that. That's all I have, Crystal, for questions. Again, to the extent I understand the topics.
That was great. That was right on. I think that's the point, is that on that one especially, that we're just trying to figure out ways for tribes to get revenue streams, and this is a new opportunity for that. So that's great.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, John, so much. We kind of slid right into right of way.
Perfect.
Louis, sorry. I hope we can, have you cut this so that it's easier. Did we have anything else we wanted to mention about right of way though? So I know that we had a few talking points and whatnot. And I know we're coming up on the hour that we had you for, John. Was there anything else that you wanted to mention?
I think it's just mostly that it's, it takes, what you want to do is to get both a good picture of the right of ways on your reservation and the status of those right of ways, and then really think about what's reasonable, because you don't want to get into a long protracted fight with the utilities, but you want the utilities to understand this, applies to them. It's a reasonable regulation. It's authorized by the federal government. The federal government stands behind tribes in doing this, and then really to set the rates at what is appropriate in light of who the lines serve and where they go, and how, where they go off the reservation as well. So I think as long as that kind of thought goes into it, tribes can, kind of assert their rights in a way that doesn't result in a lot of litigation, but instead results in substantial revenues to the tribe, and control over these lines too. You can put into the consent agreements really kind of whatever is appropriate from the tribal sovereignty point of view, making sure that they keep the lines in good condition. If there's issues you've been having with those lines historically, where the utilities or others are not taking care of them well, you can put that in the agreement as well to make sure that they're doing the right thing.
Awesome. Thank you so much. You are really and truly are a wealth of knowledge. I'm trying to think, were you part of our first energy conference that we had a few?
I think, yeah, back in the day, yes.
And what's interesting, we were mentioning this earlier, cost of, batteries and so on and so forth. I remember, was it like 5 years ago, Vince? I'm trying to remember when we had that first.
That's about right. About 5 years ago when we had that first conference, and then Godfrey and Con was there. I think you and Brian were there, if I'm not mistaken, for that inaugural energy conference, which we just got word yesterday, literally, that there's another one coming up in, when is it? February next year? February? Second or third week of February? Yeah. I mean, it was kind of, we're not quite sure if it was going to happen.
I see, with the whole COVID thing.
Yeah. I mean, is it going to be virtual, or is it going to be face to face? That kind of thing. So that part is still, I think, a little bit up in the air. But we just got word yesterday that it is so far, my understanding is it's a go.
Oh, good.
Yeah. And I know you would work with the tribe. You would work directly with the tribe after that, with their initial plans for alternative energy.
Yeah, no, they've become a real leader in this area, and they have both solar and storage now. That's gone in and going to go in more, I think, and that's probably the future of energy. Is to have a combination of these higher tech technologies that really protect, the resiliency of the reservation or the place that it's serving, and that are clean.
Absolutely. I was just going to mention though that, because you've mentioned it earlier, like 5 years ago, I remember the cost of like batteries and so on and so forth being exorbitant. And now, like you said, it's dropped, and I've seen that difference as we've held these conferences, year after year. I'm like, oh wow, that's totally different than when we first started. So it's definitely come a long way, I think.
Yeah.
Well, that's why you see these electric cars coming out all over the place now too. There's obviously Tesla everybody knows about, but everybody is pursuing that now because the batteries have gotten cheaper. And I think that they also foresee them being, I think a lot of people say that, in a couple of years or a few years, those cars will be as cheaper than upfront as gas cars, and then they'll just continue to go down in price. So that's why people are investing in things like Tesla so much, because they see that as the future, and where there's going to be both big profits for them and better world for us, frankly. It'll be a lot cheaper to drive a car in the future, and it'll be a lot cleaner.
Love it.
Very cool.
Such great opportunities. All right. Well, let's go ahead. No, it's all good. Let's go ahead and wrap this up. John provided his email, so we'll make sure that that into both. And with that, if our listeners need to reach out to Native Learning Center for any technical assistance, or maybe you didn't catch John's email, we can go ahead and, shoot that over to you. Feel free to reach out to me, Crystal Cedeno. So it's going to be KrystalCedeno at semtribe.com. I'm happy to help. And with that, be sure to stay in check with the Native Learning Center and seeing what we have coming out, for future podcast episodes, because I know that we're definitely going to do another few recordings with John because he has more information for us and we want to be able to provide that to all of you. So be sure you visit www.nativelearningcenter.com and stay in check. Make sure that you tune in on this episode, whether it be on Spotify, Simplecast, Google Podcast, and Apple Podcasts. We're kind of all over. We love hearing from you. Leave us a review. Let us know how we're doing. And that's about it. All right. Thank you all so much. And we'll catch you on the next episode. Bye for now.